Good evening, Connect Group leaders. I hope you're having a great week. I hope you're doing well. I wanted to touch base with you in regards to the next story through the Bible lesson that we'll come up to. And that one is, it's called Washing Their Feet. And it's obviously based upon the gospel story in John chapter 13, in which Jesus washes the disciples' feet. I want to give you a little background and maybe give you some insights that the book touches on very little or not at all. Hopefully that supplements your prep or enriches that or gives another talking point for you. I want to start with a bit of context as to some of the things going on while this is happening. And first thing that I want to mention is this tension that would have been happening um, from outside of Jesus and his inner circles um, happen outside of that group. That tension being the idea of whether or not Jesus was going to attempt to start some sort of earthly empire or earthly kingdom. Jesus used a lot of language um, around the word kingdom, kingdom of heaven, um, and that caused some confusion and some tension on whether or not Jesus was going to be directly competing with the Roman Empire um, or earthly governments, right? Now that would not have been a concern for Jesus. That would not have been a something that his disciples would have been extremely worried about. But there is some thought that maybe the disciples also would have wrestled with some of these questions about kingdom and what that meant, and was Jesus wanting some sort of earthly kingdom, right? There would have probably just been some questions. Now, while this certainly is not the focus of this story, and certainly not the intent here of Jesus to address that. Jesus certainly didn't wash feet um, to make any kind of statement on his intentions of earthly kingdoms or earthly empires. But if the disciples were wrestling with some of these questions of what are Jesus' intentions, or what does kingdom of heaven and earthly kingdom, how does that work? What does it look like? If they did have any of those questions, this certainly would have either cleared up for them or made more questions, depending on where their understanding was or where their thoughts were, right? Because if the disciples had these questions that again were not necessarily Jesus' focus here, but if they had some of these questions, they would certainly have um, really questioned why Jesus would put himself in this lowly state. They certainly would have questioned that if Jesus did have any intentions of earthly kingdoms, why would he put himself in the place of a servant? So again, this is not necessarily the focal point of the material, or not necessarily the intention of Jesus to address this, but I think it's interesting, at least, to think about the disciples' questions around kingdom of heaven, earthly kingdom. Now Jesus is putting himself in a lowly position. So, yeah. I also then want to talk about Jesus' action and what he actually did here. Um, it's important on a lot of levels. His action is, but specifically his action of humbling himself, and the action of making himself lower than the disciples, and serving the disciples. Now, we read that he became a servant, and quite literally became a servant in doing something um, for his disciples, something that was um, not glamorous, or not fun, not enviable in washing feet. That is. Now, we also read that he removed his robe and put a towel around his waist, and that is important because it shows that he even went as far to take on the appearance of a servant. Now, the servants in those days would have looked very similar, right? They wouldn't have had a robe. They probably would have had a um, they probably wouldn't have had any clothing above the waist, that type of thing. So it's interesting that not only did he um, take on the work of a servant, but he took on the appearance of a servant. He took away anything that would distract him from the service. He took away anything um, that would or could distract what he was doing. So, there's some implications for us there when we serve and when we act. Do we intentionally take away those areas of pride? Do we separate ourselves from things that might might show that we're not really a servant, right? Do we hang on to those things that we feel like bring us value, right? So there's some real implications there in serving and not just serving as a servant, but taking on the full appearance and the full status of a servant. Now, there's also some important things here too about Jesus' example of service and action, and this again would have been different in the time, right? Jesus was making himself humble and serving, whereas the religious leaders that were really, really, really not fans of Jesus were not doing that. That was not something that they were doing. That was not an example that they were trying to show. There would have been a lot of knowledge of the law. There would have been a lot of adherence to the law. There would have been a lot of declaration of belief and declaration of allegiance, but not a lot of action to go with it. So that would have been um, a sharp contrast and something that caught the disciples off guard as well. Now, there's also something here, and I don't want to get too much deep into this. I don't want to waste a ton of your time talking about this, but I think there is something here that's worth at least keeping in mind that when Jesus talks about the disciples being clean, there's implications here that clean equals purity, purity of the spirit, purity of mind, purity of body, right? There's a difference between the language of clean and the language of pure, right? I can have clean feet to where I can walk into my house and not track up the floors, but that doesn't mean my feet are pure, right? So there's a difference there between clean and pure, and there's some implications there on what Jesus was doing for them and what Jesus can do for us in terms of cleanliness and purity, um, both physically and spiritually, right, in the story. Lastly, I want to talk about what Jesus says in verse 17. This is one of my favorite parts of this whole passage, and that's when Jesus says, "Now that you know these things, you can be blessed when you do them." Now, I love the language here of when you do them, right? We're not blessed by knowing that Jesus wants us to wash other people's feet. We're not blessed by understanding why it's important to wash other people's feet. We're not even blessed um, by knowing that Jesus commanded this. We're blessed by doing. So the implications here of action are pretty awesome, and I think pretty important to the church today as well. Um, not to get too deep, but we live in a culture where um, we declare beliefs. The church, in general, people in general, declaring beliefs is easy. We find it pretty easy to tell people what we believe in, but it's a little more difficult to do. It's a little more difficult to be a servant. So I think the implications of Jesus saying you'll be blessed when you do them, as opposed to you're blessed because you know them, I think that's pretty important. So anyway, that's just a quick overview some of the insights, some of the extra insights into this week's material. I hope that you find them useful. If you do, awesome, let me know. If not, let me know that too. Feedback is important. Um, if there's if there's stuff that you want to know that you're not getting, if there are other things that you'd like to hear about this material, just let me know um, that as well. Again, feedback is great. Want to make sure that these things are tools for you guys to lighten your load and to enrich your prep time. So yeah, have a great week, everybody, and I hope your groups go really well. Have a good week.